The conference room at the law offices of Hardin and Wells smelled of old leather and rain. Adelaide Hartwell sat at the long table, her pen trembling above the marriage certificate. Across from her, a black man in a clean flannel shirt and worn boots waited without expression. Nathan Brooks, Royce Peyton, leaned against the back wall, swirling whiskey, and spoke with a voice that carried no warmth. "The bride," he said, "is signing under duress of her grandfather's will." A tear hit the paper. Nathan signed his name in 3 precise strokes. No one noticed the watch beneath his cuff. Everyone in that room saw a small-town black mechanic marrying above his station. None of them knew he had been quietly auditing their company for 18 months. 5 weeks earlier, on a gray afternoon in the small fishing town of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, Adelaide Hartwell stepped out of a hired sedan and stood on the cracked asphalt outside a building she would not have entered under any other circumstance. The sign above the open garage bay read Brooks Marine Repair in faded blue lettering. The shop smelled of diesel and brine, and something metallic she could not name. She wore a gray suit that was almost certainly the most expensive thing the building had ever held. She waited at the open garage door until the man inside finished tightening a fitting on a Volvo Penta diesel engine and reached for a rag. Nathan Brooks was tall, quiet, and dark-skinned, with sun-hardened forearms and a small scar at the edge of his left temple. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried the unhurried weight of someone who had stopped trying to impress anyone a long time ago. He did not seem surprised to see her. If anything, his expression carried a kind of mild resignation, the look of a man who had been expecting a knock he did not want to answer. She handed him a sealed envelope containing the relevant excerpt of her grandfather's will. He read it in silence, standing in his coveralls in the middle of his own shop. When he finished, he folded the page back along its creases and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "He left no letter for you about this," he said. "Not a question, but close to one." "No," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will need to think about it. Give me until tomorrow morning." She had come prepared for argument, for refusal, for greed. She was not prepared to be asked to wait. That evening, she drove back to Portland and sat alone in her grandfather's old corner office on the 40th floor of Hartwell Tower. Conrad Hartwell had been the most disciplined man she had ever known. He did not write whims into legal documents. Whatever this was, he had meant it. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the harbor, Nathan placed a call to a private number in Boston. The voice that answered was a woman's, dry and unsurprised. He spoke briefly. "Tell Margaret," he said, "that I said the time has come." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "Understood." He hung up and put a pot of coffee on the stove. At 10, he called Adelaide. He would sign, he told her, with conditions. They would meet at her lawyer's office on Friday. The meeting at Hollis Reed's firm was scheduled for 1 hour. It took 3. Nathan read every page of the prenuptial agreement without skimming. Halfway through, he stopped at a paragraph on the 7th page, set down his pen, and asked whether the clawback equity provision in Section 14 had been intentional or whether someone had copied boilerplate from a Massachusetts template without adjusting for Maine corporate law. Hollis Reed, who had 31 years of practice and an ego to match, looked at the page, looked again, and quietly excused himself to redraft it. Adelaide watched her supposed mechanic from across the conference table and did not say anything for a long time. Something about the way he held a pen, something about the way he read a contract, the way other men read weather. That afternoon, she informed the Hartwell board. The room responded with the practiced silence of people who had already prepared their reactions. Royce Peyton, the chief operating officer who had served under Conrad for 18 years and had expected to be named successor, spoke first. He expressed his concern gently, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had rehearsed them. He was worried, he said, about the company's public profile. He paused, then added that a forced interracial marriage arranged through a will would attract unwanted attention from investors and press alike. The word interracial sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No one moved. No one objected. He proposed an addendum, a strict prenuptial agreement, a confidentiality clause, and an exit provision permitting either party to terminate the arrangement after 12 months with minimal complications. Adelaide, who saw the shape of the trap but had no time to refuse it, agreed. Hartwell Maritime in those days was valued at roughly $1.6 billion. The company controlled a meaningful share of New England container traffic and held a long-running supply contract with the naval base at Portsmouth. A merger with Atlantic Freight, valued at $620 million, had been in negotiation for 9 months. Peton was leading the talks. 2 evenings after the civil signing, Peton hosted what he called a welcome reception for the new member of the Hartwell family. The invitation list ran to 40 people, the full board, 3 senior partners from the merger team at Atlantic Freight, and a small handful of business press introduced for the evening as old companions of the house. Nathan arrived in a 2014 Ford F-150 and a plain black suit that fit, but had not been tailored. Peton's house manager hesitated at the front door and suggested with a careful smile that Mr. Brooks might be more comfortable using the side entrance. Where deliveries arrived, Nathan looked at him without expression and walked past him through the main hall. Dinner began with a kind of cordiality that was its own form of cruelty. Peton sat to Adelaide's right and made a point of including Nathan in conversation the way a man might include a child at an adult table. He asked what a marine repair shop in Cape Elizabeth grossed in a good year. He admired the watch on Nathan's wrist and asked whether it was a tribute piece or an estate sale find. A senior board member raised his glass. To Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, he said, "May the next 12 months teach us all something about compatibility." The laughter that followed was louder than it needed to be. A woman near the middle of the table leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, just loud enough for the words to carry, that Conrad must be turning in his grave, knowing his granddaughter had signed her name next to a black mechanic from a fishing town. Adelaide did not look up from her plate. Nathan answered every question when asked. He used short, complete sentences. He drank water. He ate slowly. He did not touch the wine. Halfway through the second course, Adelaide noticed something that disturbed her. Nathan was not enduring the evening. He was counting. There was a small movement of his attention, almost invisible, as each remark landed, as if he were entering each name and each laugh into a ledger she could not see. The look on his face was not anger. It was not hurt. It was something closer to inventory. After dinner, Peton produced an additional non-disclosure agreement and presented it to Nathan with a remark about handymen and master bedrooms. Nathan read it, signed it, and slid it back without comment. In the upstairs hallway, Adelaide caught up to him by the library. "I should have said something," she said. Nathan stopped and looked at her. "You did not owe me that," he said. "Not yet." She did not understand the word yet. In the first week at Hartwell Estate, Adelaide gave Nathan the use of her grandfather's old study. It was the room she had not entered since the funeral. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the cold fireplace and the bookshelves and the worn leather chair. Then he walked in as if he were returning to a place he had once owned. He went to the cabinet beside the hearth, opened it without searching, and took out the brass kindling tongs. He stacked wood without thinking about which size to lay first. Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched, and said nothing. She told him there was coffee downstairs at 6 in the morning. Then she left him to it. The next morning, she came down at 6:15 and found him already at the breakfast table, with the Wall Street Journal folded to the shipping and logistics page. He was making notes in a small leather book with a fountain pen, a Mont Blanc that had been used hard enough to wear a shine on the cap. He looked up when she came in, nodded, and went back to his column. She had expected vaguely that the man she had married would watch sports highlights or scroll a phone. She had not expected an editorial calendar of freight indices and bunker fuel hedging schedules. She did not ask. She filed the observation and went to work. Over the next several days, she began to notice other things. He kept his boots by the kitchen door, always clean. He made his own bed. He used a single towel all week. He moved through the house with the careful discipline of a man who was used to taking up as little space as possible, not because he was small, but because he had chosen to be. When the housekeeper left a fresh set of sheets outside his door with a note addressed to Mr. Hartwell, he folded the note, set it on the hall table without correction, and made the bed himself. That weekend, the marina staff at the estate was preparing the Hartwell Hawk, a 75-foot yacht, for a paying charter the following Tuesday. The stabilization system would not initialize. 2 engineers had been at it for an hour. Walter Kowalski, the company's senior marine systems engineer and a man who had served Hartwell for 36 years, stood on the dock, with his arms folded, and a look on his face that suggested he already knew the answer, but was waiting to see if anyone else would find it. Nathan walked past on his way back from the breakwater. He paused for perhaps 30 seconds, looked at the open access panel near the port fin, and spoke quietly to the younger of the 2 engineers. The hydraulic feed on the port side, he said, was reversed. Whoever had serviced the boat the week before had crossed 2 lines. The engineer checked. The lines were crossed. The system initialized within 10 minutes. Walter Kowalski looked across the dock at Nathan and held his gaze. The look that passed between them was very brief and entirely understood. Walter said nothing. He turned and walked back into the boathouse. But the younger engineer, still crouching by the access panel, looked up at Nathan with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. It was closer to the face a man makes when he realizes he has been standing next to someone he should have been paying attention to all along. Sophie came to the estate that Saturday afternoon. Adelaide had been working in her bedroom when she heard a small knock at her door. The girl stood in the hall with a coloring book held against her chest. She was 8 years old, with careful dark eyes and 2 neat braids tied with yellow ribbons. "Excuse me," Sophie said very politely. "Do you know where the blue crayons go?" Adelaide blinked, stood up, and walked the child down to the kitchen, where she opened a drawer and found a packet of crayons her own grandmother had bought her 2 decades earlier. Sophie thanked her quietly, chose the 3 blues she needed, and went back upstairs with the careful steps of a child carrying something precious. Adelaide stood alone in the kitchen for a moment afterward, holding the drawer handle, and felt something move in her chest that she was not ready to name. She had not spoken to a child in years. She had forgotten how direct they were, how they asked for exactly what they needed, and nothing more. She thought about Sophie's braids, tied with ribbons, that someone had chosen with care that morning, and she thought about a man who repaired diesel engines for a living and still found time to match ribbons to a dress. That night, Adelaide walked the upper hallway in her socks and stopped outside Sophie's bedroom. The door was open a finger's width. Nathan was reading Charlotte's Web aloud, in a voice she had not heard him use anywhere else, a voice that was almost a whisper, but had every word in it. The way he said Wilbur's name was the way some men said prayers. Adelaide stood in the dark hallway and listened until the chapter ended. Then, she went back to her room and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the way his voice changed when he spoke to his daughter, the way it lost every edge and became something she did not have a word for. She thought about the watch on his wrist that no one at the dinner table had recognized, and the way he had read a contract like a man who had written hundreds of them, and the way he had walked into her grandfather's study as if the room had been waiting for him. There was a pattern forming in her mind, a shape she could almost see but not yet name. On the bookshelf in Nathan's study, between a worn copy of Moby Dick and a binder of marine engineering tables, sat a slim hardcover titled Maritime Risk and Hedging in Transatlantic Shipping. The author's name on the spine read N.A. Brooks. Adelaide had not yet seen it. In his office downtown, Royce Piton ended a call with Lenora Quinn, the chief financial officer, by saying that Brooks was too quiet and that he did not trust quiet, and that the Atlantic freight signing needed to be moved up by a week. Toward the end of the conversation, Lenora mentioned that at least one outside investor had raised the question of whether the company was risking its image by allowing a black mechanic to reside inside the Hartwell estate. Piton's response was immediate. "Let them worry," he said. "That is a natural weapon for us." After he hung up, he sat in the parking garage 3 blocks east and placed one more call. Lenora answered on the second ring. "She just handed us the gun," he said. "Once Atlantic Freight signs, we will have her cornered by Christmas." The call came at 2:40 in the morning. 11 days after the civil signing, the MV Hartwell Meridian, a container vessel of 280 meters, had lost steerage in a Category 3 storm off Nova Scotia. Several lashings had failed on the upper tier. The ship was listing 12 degrees, and the bridge was reporting that 2 of the boxes in the affected stack contained hazmat-class cargo. 19 sailors were on board. Adelaide was in the back of a town car within 10 minutes. By the time she arrived at Hartwell Tower, Petton was already in the navigation center on the 15th floor, leaning over the shoulder of the duty officer. He turned when she came in and spoke quickly with the controlled urgency of someone who had been rehearsing the conversation for some time. The captain, he said, had requested a southern route 3 days earlier to avoid the system. The request had been denied at the executive level on fuel cost grounds. Adelaide asked evenly who had denied it. That, Petton said, was what they were trying to determine. She watched him while he spoke. She had known the man since she was 16 years old. She did not believe him. Within 40 minutes, the European pre-market opened, and Hartwell Maritime stock fell 7%. By 4 in the morning, the wire services had picked up the story. The Canadian Coast Guard reported that weather conditions would not permit helicopter evacuation for at least 6 hours. The seas were running at 5 meters and rising. The ship's list had reached 14 degrees. Petton placed a slim folder in front of her on the navigation center table. The folder contained a draft press statement and a 1-page insurance election. He suggested gently that she might want to consider declaring the vessel a probable total loss in order to begin the claims process before further damage occurred. Adelaide read the page once. She read it again. She understood suddenly what he was doing. If she signed, the company would record the loss before the rescue had even been attempted. The market would crater. The board would have all the reason it needed to call an emergency vote of no confidence. She did not sign. Petton stepped out, ostensibly to call the insurance carrier, and she stood in the middle of the room with 19 lives on the screens above her, and no idea what to do next. She had been trained for negotiations, for quarterly reports, for the small wars of boardroom politics. She had not been trained for this. The green dots on the tracking screen moved with the storm, and she watched them the way a woman watches a clock in a hospital waiting room, knowing that the numbers meant something she could not control. She drove herself back to Hartwell Estate. The road from Portland was nearly empty at that hour. She did not turn on the radio. She did not call anyone. 50 minutes later, she walked into the kitchen of her grandfather's house and found Nathan Brooks sitting at the table in a faded flannel shirt, pouring coffee from a French press. He looked up at her without surprise. "Meridian," he said. "It has been on the coastal emergency feed since 1 in the morning. I was up. Sophie had a bad dream." She sat down across from him and told him in short sentences what was happening. The ship, the list, the hazmat containers, the 19 men waiting for a helicopter that could not fly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "Who denied the reroute?" "Everton," she said. He set the coffee down. He looked at the steam coming off the cup. Then he looked at her. "Take me to your navigation center," Nathan said. "There is a manual ballast protocol most crews do not remember. I can talk the captain through it. We have a window." Adelaide looked at him. "You are a boat mechanic," she said. It came out closer to a question than she meant. He held her gaze. "I am a man who used to underwrite shipping insurance for vessels this size," he said. "Try me or do not. Your call." In the next 90 seconds, she did not move for 10 of those seconds. Then she stood up and reached for her car keys. By 4:15, Nathan Brooks was inside the Hartwell Navigation Center, standing 1 seat back from the duty officer at the lead console. Petton blocked the doorway when he saw him and said, in the careful voice of a man trying to control a room, that this was not appropriate, that Mr. Brooks had no clearance, that the situation required focus. Adelaide stepped between them. "I am authorizing it," she said. "Step aside, Royce." Petton stepped aside. His face hardened in a way that did not show, but could be felt. He turned to his assistant and said, low enough that only the nearest row could hear, that she had just handed the command room to a black mechanic with no credentials of any kind. Nathan did not take the duty officer's chair. He stood at his shoulder and asked 3 questions, each one short. The duty officer answered. Nathan watched the AIS plot and the trim readouts and the wind data for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he spoke slowly and clearly so that the duty officer could repeat his words to the captain over the radio without losing any of them. "Tell him to flood ballast tanks 4 and 6 to 50% capacity," Nathan said. "Vent tank 1 entirely, then tell him to turn into the swell, not away. He will feel like he is making it worse for the first 3 minutes. He is not. He will regain 6 degrees within 20. The duty officer hesitated. The protocol was not standard. He turned to Walter Kowalski, who had quietly entered the navigation center 2 minutes earlier and was standing near the wall with his arms folded. Walter looked at Nathan and gave the duty officer a single small nod. "Do it," Walter said. "He is right." The order went out over the radio. The next 20 minutes were the longest the room had ever endured. Then, at 4:36 in the morning, Atlantic time, the captain of the Meridian reported that the list had stabilized at 8 degrees and was reducing. By 5:10, the ship was holding at 4 degrees. The hazmat stack had not shifted. By 6, the helicopter window had opened, and the crew was being lifted off in pairs. 19 sailors. All of them came home. When the immediate crisis ended, the navigation center fell into the particular silence of people who had not expected to live through what they had just lived through. The navigation team stood up and clapped Nathan on the shoulder, one by one, as they left. Piton did not. He waited until Nathan stepped into the corridor alone, and then followed him. "Do not think one lucky call makes you part of this company," Piton said. "Stay in your lane." He let the word lane carry weight, the way a man does when the lane he means is not professional but racial. Nathan stopped. He turned slowly, looked at Piton, and let the silence sit between them long enough to be felt. "Careful, Mr. Piton," he said at a register. Only the two of them could hear. Conrad used to say the same thing to men who did not last long here. Then he walked on. Piton stood alone in the corridor for a long time afterward and did not move. Adelaide could not sleep. At a little after 2 in the morning, she walked the dark hallway of Hartwell Estate to her grandfather's old study. She had not entered the room voluntarily in almost a year. Nathan, she knew, was not there. He had left after dinner without explaining where he was going, and she had not asked. She turned on the lamp at the corner desk and sat down in the chair. The study smelled the way it had always smelled, pipe tobacco that had not been smoked in this room for 2 decades, paper, and the faintest trace of the sea. She let her eyes wander over the bookshelves. After a moment, she stood and walked to the row Nathan had been keeping his own books on. She pulled the slim hardcover with the worn spine, Maritime Risk and Hedging in Transatlantic Shipping. N.A. Brooks. She opened the title page. A handwritten inscription filled the upper third of the page in her grandfather's familiar slanted script. "For Nate," it read. "For the conversations we never had to finish, CH 2019. Adelaide sat down on the edge of the desk and held the book in her lap for a long time without moving. She began slowly to look through the other books on the shelf. Marine insurance underwriting. A bound volume of Admiralty case law. 3 years of the Journal of Commerce with marginalia. In the same fountain pen hand she had seen at the breakfast table. The room around her began to feel like a place she had walked into without understanding. In the second drawer of the desk, unlocked, she found a small, unlabeled envelope. Inside was a single black and white photograph. 2 men stood on the deck of a freighter, the rigging behind them in the soft focus of an old camera. The younger man, dark-skinned and wearing a windbreaker, stood with his arms folded and a half-smile that she had never once seen on his face. The older, who could not have been more than 40, was unmistakably her grandfather. On the back of the print, in pencil, someone had written, "M.V. Atlantic Sentinel Sea Trials, October 1988. Nate B.A. and me." She stared at the initials for a long time before she understood that they were not B period, A period. They were 2 letters that began 2 names. She went to her own bedroom, opened her laptop, and typed the words, N.A. Brooks Maritime Risk Hedging. The author's full name appeared in the second result, in a sidebar from the Journal of Commerce. Nathaniel A. Brooks Ashford. She typed Ashford Holdings. The first result was a single-page company website, austere and informative, dated to a most recent update of 3 years prior. Ashford Holdings, the page read, was a privately held maritime and logistics company founded in 1962, headquartered in Boston, with subsidiary operations in Houston, Long Beach, and Hamburg. The page listed no photographs and no executives. She found a Forbes profile from 2018, 2 paragraphs long. The estimated net worth of the chairman, given in cautious editorial language, ranged from $5 to $7 billion. The article noted that he had not granted an interview to the press in over a decade. Adelaide closed the laptop. Then she opened it again. Then she closed it. She sat very still in her chair for what might have been an hour. She had married, by force, one of the wealthiest private men in America. She had let a room of people humiliate him with the easy cruelty of class and the sharper cruelty of race, and he had let her. In the morning, when she came down to the kitchen, Sophie was at the table with a coloring book and a juice box. The girl looked up, smiled in a small, careful way, and said, "My daddy makes good pancakes if you want some." Adelaide sat down. Nathan, in his flannel shirt, stood at the stove and did not turn around. The 3 of them ate together. Sophie showed Adelaide how to draw a sailboat in syrup on top of the pancake. Adelaide did not trust her voice that morning. She watched Nathan cut Sophie's pancake into small pieces without being asked, and she watched Sophie hold her fork with both hands the way children do when they are concentrating, and she sat in the quiet of that kitchen and understood for the first time that this man had built an entire life around making one small person feel safe. Across town, Royce Piton sent Lenora Quinn a single text message. Friday, 10 sharp. Once Atlantic Freight is signed, the board meets at noon. Vote of no confidence. She is done. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Adelaide carried the book and the photograph downstairs and laid them on the desk in her grandfather's study. Nathan was already there, reading by the lamp. He looked up at her arrival, and then at the item she had placed in front of him. "You are him," she said. "I am," he said. There was no preamble, no raising of voices. "Why did you not tell me?" she said. He considered the question for a long moment, as if he had been waiting for it, but had not decided in advance what to answer. "Because if I had told you on day 1, he said, you would have used me as a shield. Conrad did not want that. He wanted you to see the company, and yourself, clearly first, before someone handed you a weapon." She was quiet. Then she said, "He could have just told me." Nathan looked at her. "He thought you would reject the help," he said. He may have been right. She wanted to argue with that. She opened her mouth to say that she would not have rejected it, that she was not that proud, that she would have listened. But she thought about the way she had looked at him on the first day, standing in his coveralls in that shop, and she closed her mouth, because she knew, with a particular honesty that only comes at 2 in the morning, that Conrad had been right about her. She sat down across from him. "And now," she said. "Now," he said, "Royce Piton is signing Atlantic Freight tomorrow morning at 10. The board has been called for noon. They will vote you out. I have a folder. You can decide what to do with it." He took a flash drive from his shirt pocket and set it on the desk between them. She did not touch it for a moment. Then she picked it up, walked back to her room, and read every file until the gray light came up over the harbor. The documents were meticulous. Time-stamped emails, wire transfer records, shell company registrations traced through 3 jurisdictions. She read them the way her grandfather had taught her to read contracts, slowly, with a pencil in her hand. The emails alone told a story that made her stomach turn. Piton had not merely denied the reroute. He had calculated the insurance value of a total loss against the cost of fuel savings and chosen the number that benefited him. The wire transfers were worse. By the time the sun came up, she understood exactly what Royce Piton had built and exactly how Nathan Brooks Ashford intended to tear it down. At 9:50 the next morning, in the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Heartfelt Tower, Royce Piton signed the Atlantic Freight merger documents on a polished cherrywood table. while two Atlantic freight executives nodded their congratulations. He returned to the boardroom with the signed pages held lightly in one hand, like a man who had been waiting a long time for permission to smile. The board meeting opened at noon. Lenora Quinn distributed a folder of financial summaries showing what she called a pattern of erratic executive behavior on Adelaide's part over the previous 6 months. Piton spoke for 14 minutes. He cited the Meridian crisis, the 7% stock drop, the introduction of an unauthorized civilian to the navigation center during an active incident. He used the phrase corporate governance failure 3 times. Then he added, in a tone that sounded almost reluctant, that he did not wish to make this personal, but the decision to bring a mechanic, regardless of background, into a command room during a crisis represented a serious lapse in judgment. He proposed a vote of no confidence and his own appointment as interim chief executive officer. Adelaide stood when he finished. Before the vote, she said, "I would like to introduce a witness." The door opened. Nathan Brooks walked in. He was wearing a charcoal suit that did not call attention to itself, an open-collared shirt, and the same worn boots he wore everywhere. Behind him came 3 people, a tall, silver-haired attorney from Boston, a forensic accountant carrying 2 banker's boxes, and Walter Kowalski. Petten rose halfway out of his chair. "This is a closed session," he said. "Mr. Brooks has no standing here." Under Section 12 of the marriage clause Mr. Piton himself helped draft, Nathan said, "I am a 51% voting equity holder in this company. I have standing." He laid a black file folder on the table. Before the vote, he said, "I would like to enter evidence." The folder contained 3 sets of documents. The first was a chain of internal emails from Petten, time-stamped and hash-verified by the Heartfelt server's own audit log, in which he had personally overridden the captain's request to reroute the Meridian around the storm system. The second was a forensic accounting reconstruction of the Atlantic freight merger, which valued Heartfelt Maritime at $1.1 billion, more than 30% below the independent valuation prepared by an outside firm 3 months earlier. The third traced a chain of payments from Atlantic Freight through 3 shell companies, terminating in a Cayman entity whose beneficial owners were Royce Piton and Lenora Quinn. Piton went very white and said, almost calmly, that the documents were fabricated. The silver-haired attorney placed a second folder on the table without speaking. Server hashes, bank correspondence, subpoenaed wire records. The room was quiet, in the way a room becomes quiet when every person in it is recalculating their position. 2 board members exchanged a glance. A third reached slowly for the folder and began to read. Nathan let the room sit with what had just been said. Then he spoke once more, in a voice no louder than the one he had used at the kitchen table the night before. "Conrad asked me to keep an eye on this company until his granddaughter could stand on her own," he said. "I have done that. As of today, I am not watching anymore. I am voting." Walter Kowalski stood up beside him and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. The room was still. Piton, who had not yet sat back down, looked at Nathan and said with the last of his composure, "Who are you, Mr. Brooks? Who do you think you are?" The silver-haired attorney rose and addressed the room. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "is Nathaniel A. Brooks Ashford, chairman of Ashford Holdings. Over the past 11 months, at the personal request of the late Conrad Heartfelt, Ashford Holdings has acquired 34% of Heartfelt Maritime's senior debt." The board was silent. One member, an older woman near the end of the table, leaned forward. "Brooks Ashford," she said, "of the Ashford that ran the Sentinel fleet." "The same," Walter Kowalski said. "I served 8 years under his father. Conrad and Nate ran Maritime Risk Consulting together in the 80s, before either of them inherited a dollar." Nathan spoke briefly to the board. He and Conrad, he said, had been partners and friends for 30 years. His wife, Margaret, had died in 2022 of pancreatic cancer. He had stepped back from the operating chairmanship of Ashford after her death and moved with his daughter to Cape Elizabeth, where the air smelled like home and no one took her picture at the school gate. Conrad had been diagnosed with lung cancer 18 months before his death and had known by then that Peyton was building something quiet beneath the floor, but had not had the time or the proof to act on it himself. The marriage clause had not been a romantic gesture. It had been the cleanest legal instrument available under Maine corporate law to give him standing inside the Heartfelt boardroom without triggering panic in the public credit markets. The vote came 20 minutes later. By a margin that was not close, Royce Piton and Lenora Quinn were stripped of their offices, suspended pending the outcome of a federal criminal inquiry, and removed from the building by internal security before the lunch hour ended. Piton, escorted past the boardroom door, stopped and turned toward Adelaide. "He lied to you for 6 weeks," he said. "You will never trust him again." Adelaide met his eyes. "Get out, Royce," she said. He went. When the room had emptied, Adelaide and Nathan were left alone for the first time. Neither of them sat down. Sunlight moved across the cherrywood table. "I need time," she said. "Take it," he said. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the brass handle. "I should have told you," he said without turning around. "I will not pretend I should not have." Then he opened the door and walked out, and Adelaide stood by the window for a long time afterward and watched the boats move on the gray water and did not cry. 12 days passed before she drove to Cape Elizabeth. It was a Tuesday morning at the edge of November. The Brooks house was a Cape Cod cottage on a narrow road above Stony Beach. Sophie was on the porch with a sketch pad. "You came," she said. "I came," Adelaide said. Nathan stepped out in his flannel and his boots. "You want coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I judged you on the first day," Adelaide said. "I let other people humiliate you. I am sorry." He was silent for a long time. "I lied by omission for 6 weeks," he said. "I am sorry too. There is a 12-month clause," she said. "We can end it in March. Or," he said, "we can stop counting." Sophie came back out with a small wooden box of watercolors and set it between them with the seriousness of a child handing over a trust. "You have to wait for the first layer to dry," she said. "Daddy says everything good takes layers." Adelaide picked up the brush. On the table between them, beside the cooling coffee, Nathan's old watch lay quietly, unworn that morning. He had left it there as a small kind of answer. Neither of them had been looking, but somewhere between Portland and Cape Elizabeth, on a porch that smelled of salt and turpentine, they had stopped counting.